Hey everybody, good evening. Welcome to Limmud Tzedek, the study of justice. We're going to be studying justice tonight. And let's see, I see so many of you out there. Do I see Rabbi Brous out there?
I'm here. I made it.
Hey.
Hello, nice to see you.
Okay, so we're Rabbi Brous and I are going to be leading this class together. I'll do some of the driving tonight, and Rabbi Brous will take the wheel next week. But we'll both be here in these classes and in dialogue with one another and with you all. And this is really like meant to be. It's going to be a class, but it's also meant to be a kind of a discussion space. I guess I'll just start by saying that we're doing this because isn't it obvious, right? Like justice is clearly one of the central concerns in our community, right? Our community, in a sense, and thanks to Rabbi Brous in large part, our community is really built around this principle, and our community is built around this principle, and so really is our Torah. Our Torah, one of the central concerns of our tradition, clearly is justice, and we know that because it's chock full of laws, and we know that because of the sort of famous statement, Tzedek, Tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, right? A lot of us have heard that famous phrase, but I guess the point of this class is to ask, okay, but what are we pursuing? What is it? What is justice? We've got this whole system in Judaism, but what is tzedek? What is the value that we are in pursuit of? So that's in all kinds of different ways. That's the central question of this class, and we're going to be tackling it in different ways as we move from week to week. But I would just say that the purpose of this class in some ways then is to give some kind of intellectual or philosophical kind of foundation to all the justice work that we do in this community, to sort of like give some theory to the practice. But actually the opposite is also true, and maybe more true, which is that the point of this class is that we learn to better articulate our concept of justice so that we can better practice it. Right? Like class is really meant for people like me who spend too much time in books to really think about, okay, what are the implications of this study? Like, well, how do we a famous rabbinic teaching is that lo midrasha ha'ikar ela maseh. The study is not the ikar, the essence, the point of it all. It's the doing. So everything that we are going to be talking about here is in the service of doing, in the service of living it out. And to that end, we have structured this class to kind of sync up with, really inspired by the work of our Minyan Tzedek group. This class meets at the same time. Our Minyan Tzedek organizing team meets on the third Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock. And we've structured this class so that it can be a kind of conversation around the work of Minyan Tzedek. And I am hoping and I am encouraging everybody in this discussion to, as part of the class, show up also to the Minyan Tzedek organizing group on the third Thursday. So we're going to meet 3 weeks of the month, and then the fourth will be, or the third in the order, will be the Minyan Tzedek organizing meeting. And I hope not, for the sake of our good discussion, I hope that you also participate in that group, because this is supposed to be a kind of an integrated experience. I'm really excited to be doing this with Rabbi Brous, I have to say, particularly excited to be doing it with Rabbi Brous. It would be strange in this community not to have her voice here, because Rabbi Brous has sort of managed to do this remarkable thing, which is to wake up the Jewish community to something that was right in front of our faces, right? To sort of to reawaken our eyes to the centrality of justice in our tradition, in our founding narrative. And I think it's, I've done legal studies. So I have kind of a legalistic approach to like, what's the theory? What are the laws? What's the structure? But Rabbi Brous is coming from a different voice in our traditions, the sort of prophetic voice in our tradition, which is a place of, well, you know, I won't speak for Rabbi Brous. Maybe, maybe you'd like to also say a few opening words.
All right. Thank you all so much. I'm really thrilled to be doing this, and I'm so looking forward to this kind of public chavruta with my friend and all of our teacher, Rabbi David Kasher. So it's really great to be with all of you. I want to tell you two very quick stories as we start, just to set a little bit of a context. And some of you may have heard this over the years. I don't often speak about this, but David and I were living in New York at the other David Light. In my household, he's not called the other David, he's just David. And we were planning to move out to Los Angeles. And so I applied for a job out here in Los Angeles. And there were very few pulpits that were available that year. And so I was looking for a position, and I got to the interview stage with one of the pulpits that was available. And the team was very agitated because on my resume and in my application, I said that I got a master's degree in human rights at Columbia. I was studying at the School of International and Public Affairs and the law school there while I was in seminary at JTS. And they were really agitated by this because they felt that this would mean that human rights and civil rights and justice work would distract me from being a rabbi. And so why was I applying for a rabbinic position? And one of the people on that interview call actually said to me, look, if what you want to do is tikkun olam, you go to the Reform synagogue down the street. We don't do tikkun olam, we do Talmud Torah here. So Rabbi Kasher, I don't know if I ever told you this story. And I was so stunned by it because I actually could not conceive of Talmud Torah, of the study of Torah, that was not ultimately in the service of building a framework that would help us be more decent human beings to build a more just and loving society. And I also, as a Jew, really had wedded my understanding of what the work of justice was to the Torah that I saw as a foundation for it. And so what I saw them trying to do was separate out these worlds. And I just couldn't abide it. I couldn't believe it. So it was one of the only pulpits available. And I thought, like, okay, so I'm not going to have a job for this year. I'm going to have to find another way to pay the bills. So that's the first story. And I think that in many ways, over the course of the past many years, we've worked really hard to try to integrate these worlds so that there aren't Eddie Carr, the activists and the learners in the daveners, and then the people who just want to socialize at the scotch, and the coffee. That we're all a part of this conversation, that we're trying to find the foundations from our tradition through our learning of the ways that we can be better activists and better citizens and better civilians, better humans in the world. The second story is that shortly after we got started at IKAR, which was about a year and a half after we moved here, I was taken out to lunch by a really extraordinary rabbi who was retiring. And this was a person I deeply, deeply admired. He really stood at the forefront of a lot of the great justice work that was happening. And he was the rabbi who always had a picture with the Pope. And, he was on the front lines, and also very visibly so. And he said to me that day, he said, I'm watching what you're doing at IKAR. And he said, don't be like me. Don't build your rabbinate like my rabbinate. And I said, what are you talking about? You've built this incredible rabbinate. You are really on the front lines of justice work. You've built all these incredible relationships. He said, no. He said, I am an entertainer. My community loves that I do the work of justice. My community loves that I have all these multi-faith relationships so that they don't have to. And then they feel good about themselves because they can say, oh, that's my rabbi. And he said, don't do that. You need to build a community of activists. Don't just be an activist. And what I'm so grateful for over all these years is looking at this extraordinary mix of people who found their way to IKAR over the years and seeing that we've really built a community of activists. And I feel like we are in a beautiful chorus together where we are taking inspiration from each other, we are pushing and challenging each other, and work together collectively figuring out what it means to live through these really extraordinary times. So I share both of those with you because it's very clear to me that the work of learning has to be wedded to the work of activism and vice versa, and that this cannot be just a rabbinic conversation or the clergy do this thing, but rather our whole community is involved in it. And I don't need to convince you of that because I'm looking at your faces and I see the people who are in the work every day who are part of this community. And so I'm so grateful for the opportunity for all of us to further deepen our understanding of what the roots of this work really are in our tradition, and to see what we all might learn and how it might enrich us personally, but also help us ultimately rededicate ourselves to the extraordinary work ahead. So thank you for being with us. I'm really excited about what this series will bring for all of us.
All right. So let's get started. I want to lay some kind of foundations, I hope, just some theoretical kind of foundations, and then begin to open up the conversation. I want to invite you into the conversation, and Rabbi Brous and I will sort of be in dialogue with each other and with you, and hopefully it'll actually, even with 100 people on the call, it'll actually be a conversation. So when we start talking about justice, we're talking by implication about a society, right? Justice, the concept implies a social order. And sometimes we use the phrase social justice, but justice itself implies a society, implies maybe a government structure, maybe a set of laws, the nature of how you go to war, how you start a revolution, right? Like justice, the concept is a social concept. But before we get to the social order, to a just social order, we have to think about, but prior to that, we have to think about something called ethics. And ethics is about good and bad conduct. What does it mean to behave in the morally correct way? What does it mean to behave in the right way? And that's just with one other person, or maybe not even with another person. How do I just, in my little personal sphere, how do I behave well, correctly, right? And in order to ask that question, I have to go even a step back further and say, what does it mean for something to be right or wrong? A very, very basic question. And that's the question that I want to ask you all tonight. What does it mean to say something is right or wrong? How do we say that? Like, we're eventually getting, the place that we're headed is to this sort of remarkable moment of revelation that we have in our tradition, where God Almighty comes down on top of a mountain, and instead of, blowing our minds with like some divine transcendent experience, what God gives is law. What God gives is principles of justice. That's where we're headed. We have to figure out how it is that this religion is structured around a just social order. But before we get there, we have to ask, before we even consider the topic of justice, we have to ask, well, what is right and wrong? How do you determine whether something is good or bad or just or unjust? So maybe I'll just open that up there. I'd love to hear Rabbi Brous's thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this. What does it mean to say something is good or bad? And I guess in particular, is there any way to say that with any absolute certainty? Or is it all just sort of relative? Is it all just culturally constructed? Does every culture have its own idea of good and evil? Or is there some absolute goodness? Is there some absolute true sense of what is right and wrong? So, Rabbi Brous, what do you think? I mean, is there an absolute good in the world, or do we all have our own definition of it? Is it a subjective or culturally constructed notion, the notion of good and evil?
It's a very good question. The first thing I think of is something that I want to credit to Rabbi David Ellenson that I learned in his name, which is, he said that if the voice of God whispering in your ear tells you to take the life of another person, then it's not really the voice of God. But if the voice of God whispering in your ear tells you to love another person, then that's truly God. And so I would like to propose that if it is in the service of expanding rights, access, privilege, and opportunity, then that seems like a good. And if it's in the service of denying others rights, access, privilege, and opportunity, that seems like it's fundamentally wrong. And I know that we can find ways to disprove that. I'm sure that we can find exceptions, but as a general rule, is the action that we are considering, if it's just and right, or if it's unjust and wrong, one that will be an act of compassion toward another, or one that will impinge on the rights of another? I think that might be a good starting point for the conversation. Does it help or does it harm? In fact, I heard a senator the other day who was being challenged on the use of reconciliation in the Senate, because several years ago, he said that he opposed using reconciliation in the Senate, which was going to be used in order to pass the tax cuts for the wealthiest. And that same senator now wants to use reconciliation in the Senate in order to get immediate COVID benefits to people who are suffering and struggling in poverty and unemployment because of COVID. And so he was asked, but I don't understand. Years ago, you said this, and now you say this. And he said, if ultimately what we're trying to do is limit the rights of some people, then that's a tool that shouldn't be used. But if we're using the same tool in order to help save people's lives, then I think that tool could be useful. So I'll put that out there as a starting point for conversation.
All right, great. So now we have something to dig into here. Just note that in Rabbi Brous's description there, right, there is the possibility for questioning even divine law, for questioning even God itself, right? Now, because you might have assumed that in a religious tradition, the answer to the question of what is good and what is bad is just what does the Torah say? Right? What does God say? Whatever God says is good. And that isn't the answer that Rabbi Brous gave, right? That you might actually look into the Torah, you might actually hear the voice of God and still have some other notion of what is right and wrong. So the question is, where do you get that notion? Right? Rabbi Brous gave us one standard for evaluating, but I'd love to hear a couple of other voices here. Does anyone have a strong response to the question of how do you know what is good and what is evil? Stephen Volk. Let's see, I think I have to ask you to unmute you. Yeah, there you
go. Okay, thanks, and thanks for this great conversation. I guess I would just say from Torah on to Kant, the idea of the golden rule sort of tells you one way of looking at it, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so the sense of how you treat your community and treat others is how the sort of dignity with which you would want to be treated as well. So a kind of an Kantian imperative as well in that same sense.
Okay, it's a great definition, and also one that's sort of inherently socially constructed. I'm always thinking about how my behavior affects others through the lens of how their behavior might affect me. So the very notion of right and wrong seems to imply a social order. Amy Schweiger, what do you think?
It's actually Brous.
Oh, Brous.
Hello, how are you? To begin with, you're talking about Tzedek, so I think you need to be talking in a fairly global sense of that and not restricting yourself to individual concepts of justice. But you trained as a lawyer, I trained as a lawyer, and there are two basic concepts of wrong, which are wrong because it's wrong. Theft, killing, that sort of thing. But there's the other concept of wrong because we say it's wrong. And the question is, who's saying that? Is it a religious, moral, ethical issue, or is it just the laws of the state of California or the rest of the world? The global idea is, if you're doing something that hurts people, one person or a whole bunch of people, it's wrong. And if you're doing something to mitigate that hurt, or avoided altogether? Probably that's right.
Okay, so like we hear hints here of what we might call a utilitarian ethic. That is, the more suffering that an action causes, the more you have a sense that this is a wrong action, right? The more benefit that an action provides, the more you have a sense that this is a good action. So what we're thinking about is how much harm or good do our actions create, again, in the social order, right? But Brous also wonders if there isn't also a category of things that are just inherently wrong. They're just by their very nature wrong, right? And that's a different formulation than the how does it affect people, okay? Let's take one more comment, and then we're going to start to look at, we'll do a little bit of learning together. We're going to dive into some places in the tradition where these questions are discussed. But Kate, what do you think about this? Kate, Matt?
Yeah.
It is actually, hello?
Yeah.
It's Matt, here he is.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm the slightly different version of the golden rule, but I'm convinced by my poor understanding of Buber that you have to treat people as ends, not as means. It's the same thing taken a different way. That people are people, and you have to treat them as people, and most everything else flows from that. But stepping back a little bit, I also think that you have to believe in your morality to the point that you will stand before God and say, what I did was right. I don't, you told me to do X and I did Y because it was right. Because otherwise you're doing what you're told, not doing what you believe.
Okay, great. So this is helpful. Just in these opening comments, we have various reference points for thinking about our own sense of right and wrong. And one of them, it might be God. Like, what does God say? Or what does God's book say? Or what does my sacred tradition say? And is that always, will I always accept that as indeed the true good or the true evil? So that's one way of looking at it. And another way of thinking about it is, well, how will this affect other people? My concepts of good and evil are inherently social, inherently implicate a social order, right? So do I need other people to know what good is? Do I need God to know what good is? Or is there some kind of internal work, just sort of independent, I can figure out this is a good that I know for sure that, I don't know, stealing is always wrong. Like, can I discern these principles just by, I don't know, going deep or cogitating on it, right? Like, or do I need some outside reference point? Okay, these are the questions that are going to be guiding us this evening. And when, let's bring some Torah into the mix. When we ask the question, how do we know what is good and what is evil? In Jewish tradition, we've got a perfect place to go in the Torah to begin asking that question, because we've got a scene with just that phrase, the knowledge of good and evil. And it's one of the very first scenes in the Torah, in the Garden of Eden. So I'm going to give you now a little source sheet that you can take a look at, but I'll be sharing it as well. So here in the chat is just a source sheet that has the text that we're going to look at tonight. But there's one major text that we're going to be focused on, and it is this moment where the tree of knowledge of good and evil is introduced and then immediately prohibited. Right? It's a very kind of strange moment. So let's just take a look at this first text, because this is going to be our kind of jumping off point for this question of how one knows what is right and what is wrong. So here it is, second chapter in the whole Torah, and the person's just been made. Right? God has just made Adam, this person. And we read, Vayetzav Hashem Elokim al ha'adam lemor mikol eitz hagan achol tochel. From every tree of the garden you are free to eat. Umi eitz hadat tov v'ra lo tochal mimenu. Ki biyom achalcha mimenu mot tamut. But as for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and I'm actually not sure if evil is the right translation here. Could be evil or could just be good and bad. That may make a difference in the way some of you understand this. But whatever it is, there's this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, bad, and God doesn't want us going anywhere near it. God doesn't, we can eat anything in the garden, but don't touch this tree. Okay, so, okay, immediately we've got a couple of questions, right, that just jump out from this strange formulation. One is, what is the knowledge of good and evil? Like, what would one be getting from this tree? These two concepts have just been introduced, and they've been introduced in contrast to one another. So what is it? What is the thing that this tree would provide? And then, of course, the second question is, why doesn't God want us to have that? And that's a really vexing question. But let's hold on that question first, and let's just take the phrase Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, what do you think that is? What does this tree have? What does it mean that there's a tree and its fruits contain the knowledge of good and evil? Just in the context of the story, do you have any read on that? Is there, as we read through, are we supposed to understand what that tree would provide? Okay, anyone have a reading of that or response to that? Let me ask Rabbi Brous. Do you have a thought about this?
I have so many thoughts about this. I would love to hear what a few other folks have to say first, and then I'm
okay, fine. So I see some hands. Andrea.
I'll pass. I had a comment before. I'll let
Okay.
someone else go.
All right. What about Alex? Alex Toygar.
Shalom, everyone. I agree with David and Sharon, but the thing is how we learn what is good, what is bad. The one way we learn from Torah, yeah? And the tree, maybe some branches evil, some good. And basically same trees, bad, evil, and good, probably in the same place, but we have to distinguish what is evil, what is good. And how can we distinguish good and bad, justice, unjust? We need to learn. If we do not learn,
this is great. Alex is really highlighting and emphasizing the idea that there's this knowledge and it's outside of us, right? Like if nothing else.
So how we are going to how can we get the knowledge? That's the thing. We can learn knowledge from Torah, from our parents, from our teachers, books, or our life experiences. Right? We have to learn knowledge. Knowledge should come somewhere else and teach us this is good, this is bad. And
good.
When we look at the Torah.
Great. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, okay. So I want to just underscore what Alex is suggesting here, which is that the good and evil is not something one just senses inside oneself. This image, this tree that is sitting there, suggests that good and evil is something that must be acquired. The knowledge of good and evil is something that must be learned. It's not something that you would just know intuitively. You'd have to somehow figure it out. And that already is a big statement. Sam Hutman, what do you think?
I'm thinking of the words conscience and shame, and just this idea that both of those things, you don't really think of a baby born with a conscience or shame, thankfully, but that these are also things that are introduced to us, hopefully for good and not for bad. I mean, shame shouldn't be used as a punishing tool, but it hopefully is a guiding moral tool. Like, because, you know, when you're teaching little kids, you're like, well, if you feel it in your gut that it's wrong, follow that. So there is this internal understanding inside all of us. So it's not a fully formed thought, but I think the ideas of conscience and shame are these things that that are not innate, and yet they are sort of somatic. And they are partially innate. Like the first time a baby hits somebody and sees that person go, oh, hoo, hoo, the baby will look and be surprised. Oh, that affected. Like they're, you know, so it's very delicate, this thing we're talking about. That's what I think.
Yeah, great. this idea that we might need to learn what it is that is right and wrong means, and as Sam is describing it, that there's a kind of maturation process, and that like there's different between childlike instincts and the learning of right and wrong. And part of that learning, suggests Sam, involves a kind of self-consciousness and maybe even shame, maybe even a sense of shame. If I did a wrong action, I would feel ashamed, right? Now, I have to just tell you that one of the first things that happens, one of the ways that we can ask the question, what's in that tree? What's in that tree? Is to look at, well, okay, they eventually eat from that tree. So what happens? And I was thinking of this as Sam was talking, because take a look at what happens when they eat from this tree. Here in chapter 3, they eat the tree, they both eat it. She took the tree and she also gave some to her man and he ate. And then we read, then the eyes of both of them were opened and they perceived that they were naked. And they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. So what does that mean? Like they eat the tree and they get the knowledge of good and evil. And the first thing that they see is, oh my gosh, I'm naked. And I'm a little embarrassed about that. I want to cover myself up. So it's like thinking about that as Sam was describing this sense of self-awareness and this self, perhaps even of shame, that may be part of the maturation process that leads us to a clear sense of what we believe is right and wrong and good and evil, right? All right, let's hear some more thoughts. Anthony.
It seems to me that if we eat the fruit, we are ingesting and taking into ourselves an ability to know what's right and wrong. And we might compare this with Sinai, where we're told, you do this, you don't do that, do this, don't do that. So they're two very different things. And this is a bit mischievous maybe, but when God tells us not to eat from the tree, maybe he's telling us, like some of our parents or grandparents or ancient rabbis might have told us, don't think for yourselves, I'll tell you what to do.
Okay, so this brings us in some ways to our second kind of big question of the evening. It's just, why doesn't God want us to have access to this? Now, God's going to spend so much time in the Torah saying, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. But the very first thing that we're told not to do is not to gain a knowledge of good and evil. Like, what is that? Right? So far, we've been asking the question, what is good and evil? But let's begin to introduce this other question. Like, well, why would God not want us to have that? What's wrong with knowing good and evil? Seems like that's the foundation for everything else. So what's the hesitation? Okay, so I'm introducing that question. I'm going to turn to hands that were already up. So Yael.
I'm thinking of the word empathy. And I'm thinking that maybe God didn't want us to learn good and evil intellectually. Maybe God wanted us to develop our sense of good and evil from the empathy that he provided within us when he created us.
Rabbi Brous, can I invite you in to comment on that?
Yes, I think, Yael, thank you for that. Rabbi Elman, I'm so interested in the way that you just read this text, because I see it similarly, but we come to a very different conclusion. It seems to me that what might be going on here is that not that God is saying, don't think for yourself, but think for yourself. That don't just ingest someone else's understanding of what's right and wrong, but learn how to trust, learn how to cultivate and then trust your own moral compass. Learn how to develop a sense from within of what is good and what is evil. That's not something you can access from the outside. That's something you have to learn how to develop internally, which is similar to what Yael just lifted up.
So that's interesting. So that's almost like what you and Yael are suggesting is that this is the problem with the fruit of the tree of good. I mean, you might ask, well, why is it there to begin with? But the problem with it is that it's a shortcut.
Yes.
You're ingesting everything, but that's not what it means to come to know good and evil. You have to actually learn it get there, develop, have experiences, right? And not just sort of eat the thing and know that that's not the goal, and maybe that's impossible in some way.
Right. And it brings me back to something that Matt offered a few minutes ago, which helps me reformulate my initial answer to you, which is, how do you know if something is actually good or evil? And it might be that the mechanism for evaluation is, does what you are doing suppress or does it help manifest the divine in another person? Does what you're doing suppress or does it help manifest the humanity in yourself or another person? Maybe that's the mechanism for determining, because even something like stealing, we could all come up with a scenario in which stealing is actually the right thing to do, right? I mean, it's not objective. The question is, what are you stealing for? Are you stealing to enhance human dignity in the world or to diminish it? To enhance the godliness in a person or to take it away? And so in a way, if that's the, there's a whole question around how to parent teenagers with their devices, because do you get the spyware so that you can actually track what they're sending and receiving on Snapchat before it disappears? And there's a whole movement among parents that, like, even though you can, you don't, because what you need to do is cultivate within your child a sensitivity to what is right and what's wrong. And you want them ultimately to know what pictures not to send, because they have it in their hearts, rather than because they're afraid that you're going to see it through the spyware, right? So it seems like perhaps that's what's happening here, that God is interested in us developing our own internal sense. This is the Tselem Elohim, that each of us has the creative capacity and the godlike capacity to make these kinds of determinations. And the fruit is just an externalization. It's something outside that might give you an answer. Don't trust that. Learn how to trust within your heart what might enhance and what might diminish another person as the way of gauging what might be right or wrong.
Okay. All right. So this is great. So maybe eating the fruit is actually like, you eat the fruit and they're like, stealing is wrong. That's what you get from the fruit. But it's more complicated than that. Right. It requires an awareness of life's textures and various possibilities, and you have to live that. You have to live that to know it. So that's okay. Great. That's interesting. All right, let's bring some other people into the conversation. Steve Burns.
Hi. This has been great so far. This is one of my least favorite passages in the Torah, because the shame. I don't think shame and justice really have a place together. I think doing justice work based on shame, that doesn't really work for me. And shame isn't knowledge. Shame is, it's I guess what Sam was talking earlier about conscience, but I think a lot went wrong as soon as Adam and Eve acquired shame.
Okay. All right. So Sam put it in positive terms, right? Self-awareness, self-reflection. Steve's a little worried that there's something not useful about that idea that one would be ashamed of one. Should that really be part of our awareness of what right and wrong is? Is a kind of like an embarrassment and a self-critique and everything that goes along with that? All right. Esra.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I have found Torah to be this really exciting and confusing place to come back to over the years on this question, because, there are these passages in the Torah where, the good thing to do when a child disobeys his parents is to stone him. And then many years later, the rabbis come along or tell us no, or maybe we need a Sanhedrin. And so this leads me to conclude that maybe, to come back to one of your original questions, that good and evil is indeed, I want it to be timeless in a way. A part of me wants it to be timeless in Torah. I want to find these Torah values that have been around since, forever. Once was taught by Rav Elisha Anshelovitz, and he would talk about how halacha is based on like these values that are timeless, and he had this really interesting way of like unraveling it. But Torah is changing too, maybe, I guess. And so I do believe that it is culturally constructed, as much as I want it not to be, and it changes over time, and the way we read Torah changes over time. And so, on the one hand, I want a constancy there, and maybe we try, I think, to point to a constancy, but I do think it changes over time while we're hopefully doing the best we can. But, Jews own slaves. Like, what's that about? How did this happen? And so, I would just say, I do think it's culturally constructed and changes over time, but there's also the notion that Torah is ever evolving and changing over time. So maybe that's a way to have both and.
Good. So just notice, and Esther's doing a great job of pointing out for us that part of what this means to develop a sense of right and wrong within oneself is that that is what gives us the ability that Rabbi Brous spoke about at the outset to question even the tradition. Right? Esther mentioned God says to stone your child if your child is rebellious. Well, the rabbi said, no, that doesn't seem like a good idea. Where did they get this idea that they should question the Torah? The Torah is from God. Right? Shut up. Just do what the Torah says. But that's not the way our tradition works. And if that's not the way our tradition works, it may be because we got that fruit. Something in that fruit gave us the ability to turn around and look at God itself, look at the Torah itself and say, no, I don't agree. I have a sense of what's right and wrong, right? So that's like that's a maybe we start to understand why God's a little afraid of us having that knowledge. Right? Estelle, what do you think?
Or maybe this is exactly what God wanted to cultivate in us. Don't look for the easy answer. Don't just take Torah as if it's a piece of fruit that will give you all the answers. Instead, learn how to develop your own sensibility that will give you, that will teach you that even when the Torah says, if a man kills another man, mot yumat, surely he shall die, the rabbis respond saying, a court that executes even once in 70 years is a court with blood on its hands, because the rabbis have a moral sensibility that matches their fidelity to Torah, but it comes internally. It just has to. They're acknowledging that they don't want to live in a world that's going to tell them that you stone a child to death, or that you torture a woman who's suspected of adultery, or that you take an eye for an eye. And so maybe this is a metaphor, the taking of this fruit, and God's resistance to it is there's not an easy answer here. When it comes to the taking in the knowledge of good and evil, you have to work for it, you have to cultivate it, and then you manifest it over the course of a lifetime. And you build a human community where people disagree over it, they argue over it, and together you work toward creating a more perfect union where we're going to discern what the truth actually is.
Okay. Just notice what Rabbi Brous has just done so beautifully is to answer a question that's kind of been hovering above all of this, which is, why is the tree there in the first place? Like, what is this tree doing there? God doesn't want us eating from it, right? And Rabbi Brous suggests maybe God does. Like, maybe that's the whole point. It's like, oh yeah, don't eat from it. But actually, that's the point, is that you do have to develop your own independent moral intuitions, right? All right, let's keep building on that. Estelle?
Thank you. Hi. That's where I was going to go. I think of the Torah as a Rorschach for the human soul. I think of the Torah as something that we look at and see a reflection of ourselves. And so when God says, you don't eat of the tree, it's there, and the temptation is there. But there's also a work that has to be done if you have knowledge of good and evil. It isn't an absolute. It is a constant reflection. It is constant containment, because if you know good and evil, the tendency is to judge. The tendency is to move in a direction where I know good and evil, and so you're good, you're evil, and it separates and it divides and it condemns and it causes shame. And I mean, everybody, I've listened to everybody, and I think everyone has contributed to one of the facets of what this is talking about, which is it's an opportunity for us to look at what do we do if we have this knowledge of good and evil? How do we contain this? How do we implement this? How do we apply this to ourselves? How do we create social structure with this knowledge? Is it an absolute? Is it relative, as Rabbi Brous said, where there are circumstances that challenge our traditional judgment? And what is judgment about? And how do we have compassion and empathy with judgment? I mean, all of these things. So I think it is an opportunity. We have the ability innately, because someone said, we know as children what's right and wrong, but how do we use this in a compassionate and empathetic way and build relationships that foster people becoming more connected to their souls and to a universal good. Yes.
Okay, so just listen to what Estelle is describing, because she's describing hard work.
Yes.
Hard work.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. Growth, we're talking about development, we're talking about the process, but it means that actually then we're stuck in the world trying to figure this stuff out. And that's not easy. And we will be, as we get into these questions, we will be left uncertain, struggling, wondering, getting it wrong sometimes. And so I want to use this as an opportunity to just to ask one last question and maybe sneak in one last text here, which is, the question is it worth it? Would we have been better off without all this morality? And I want to ask this question by way of introducing a commentary, one of the most philosophical commentaries on the Torah, the commentary of the Ramban, Moses Nachmanides. And I want to give you his description of what it was to ingest the knowledge of good and evil. Because what he's describing makes it sound like it's actually would have been better if we hadn't. Okay? Because what he says is, it seems to me that at first, human beings just followed their natural instincts to survive and reproduce, just like everything under the heavens, which operate according to truth and do not deviate from their appointed tasks, right? All the animals, they just follow their instincts. The planets move in the direction that the laws of physics have them move, right? So there was no love or hate in their actions. They just did what an animal does. There's no good and evil involved. But the fruit of this tree gives birth to the will and desire, so that those who eat it are then able to choose a thing or its opposite for the good or the bad. And that's why it's called the tree of knowledge, da'at, of good and evil, because da'at in Hebrew refers to will or intention. Okay, so it's a complicated way of saying, oh, what was that knowledge? It was the ability to choose. But in the description, it sounds like he's saying, oh my gosh, just leave us in the Garden of Eden, like little lambs running around, unconcerned, no sense of right and wrong. We just do our nature. Would that have been better? Is all of this good and evil just like the muck of human life? So I want to just throw that into the mix as well as we take the last few comments. Let's see, Rabbi, we're going to call on Rabbi Len and then Rabbi Zaki. Rabbi Len, you there?
There's so much to say. Hear me?
Not well. Try again. Okay, I'm gonna try. I just asked you to unmute.
No. Okay, no, I got it. So,
okay, great.
No, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes.
For me, the challenge, because look, the rabbis at IKAR, my childhood rabbis, and my USY regional director taught me one approach to Jewish ethics, right and wrong, and everything as described by you and Rabbi Brous lines up with that. My challenge is when other people see other values rooted in the Torah. So that's my challenge as it relates to ethics, like how we parse out, how to proceed in a civil way when we're in a conversation when the ethics, both seemingly rooted in the Torah, are in conflict. Never mind between different religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where I get some of my pain.
Yeah, I know that pain. right? And I just described a kind of state of nature where you just do your instinct. But there's another simple way of living that you could describe, which isn't the state of nature, but just like whatever the Torah says, right? Like, shouldn't this be easier? Just follow the Torah, stop thinking so much. What is all this like work that we have to do to cultivate our sense of our intuition? It's like, it brings us into this mess, this conflict, this dilemma. Okay, Rabbi Zach.
Because what it's
didn't hear that. Rabbi Zaki, are you
Hi,
on?
yes, I was
Hi.
just trying to unmute. So I kept thinking about that apple, and the apple has a bunch of seeds in it. And if I was to consume that apple, I would grow the tree inside my essence, and I could possibly influence others, giving them the choice to choose between good and evil through my actions, because it came up through me. So it's like I became the fertilizer, the earth, through the seeds of the apple that I ate. And that could cause people to behave inappropriately or maybe do some good. So I'm just
Okay.
imagining the tree growing through me and challenging the next people. And it's not coming from God then. It's that I'm influencing people.
Okay, good. So Rabbi Zaki, in a way, is pointing us towards where we're headed in subsequent classes, which is like right now we're trying to figure out, how do I decide what I do? How do I decide what a good action for me is? But very quickly, once we gain the knowledge of good and evil, then the question becomes, well, do I have any obligations to think about other people's actions? Should I influence other people? Should I spread good? Right? All of a sudden, I'm beginning to think about that social order. Okay, Abby.
Okay, when I, have started reading about this, it always brought me back to something I had learned a long time ago about Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and how we start out as people and we are growing. So we start out with just, most of it is punishment, obedience, the beginning stages of how we are as a group, and then how we can go through different stages and become more of an individual with our free will, and how we can look at like what is just and what isn't just, is relative, and it's based on, yes, it's based on culture, and it's also based on sort of being able to abstract and not have things just so concrete. And so we're, I think right now at the beginning in Genesis, we're just at the beginning of the very early stages. And later on, I don't know how familiar you are with Kohlberg's theory, but it's always resonated with me because it's about how each of us can reach different levels of being able to be moral and just, and individually, as a group first, and then individually, sort of what Sharon Brous was bringing up about justice, what is right and wrong.
That's really interesting. Yeah, whatever they've gotten in this story, it's just the beginning, right? Like they ingest something, have some awareness, but there's a long process. We're gonna be tracing a long journey of the development of the ethical sense, of the moral sensibility of the people of Israel, and we're just like in the first formulations of it.
Right. So at the very beginning, it's just punishment. Yeah, I mean, most of the Torah is based on following laws, punishment, or obedience. And I think it's afterwards, just maybe that's just our basis that we start with. And now as a group together, we can learn how to become, look at justice in a different way, look at what is just, it's not just punishment. It's not, like sometimes you have to break the law, if it's not right.
Great. We're running down towards the end of our hour, so I'd love to call on Rabbi Brous again to maybe speak to this. If you have thoughts about what Abby is pointing to, which is this, like, okay, so here we are, just first learning these terms, good, evil, where does all that, but like, there's a journey that's being kind of that's being mapped out for us in the Torah. There's a kind of perhaps an evolution of our ethical sensibility. Do you have any way of framing that for us, or speaking to that sort of journey, or what does that evoke for you?
Yeah, I mean, Abby, thank you for raising that. And I hope this is something we're going to be able to address over the course of time, because it does seem like there has to be a maturing of the people for us to be able to accept some of what God is asking of us, which is really to be covenantal partners. Because you can't be a covenantal partner if you don't yet have a sense of self. And it takes a lot to develop a sense of self. It takes a lot of life experience, a lot of suffering, a lot of growth. And so I think that if we look at the covenantal relationship between the earliest covenantal bond between Abraham and God, and compare that to the covenantal relationship with the Israelites, say even at the end of the book of Shemot, you see some very different dynamics. And so I do believe that this develops over the course of time based on what we're able to handle as a people. I know that our time is almost up, but I saw that I know Sean and Tony have had your hands up for a long time, and Judith, I see your hand too. I'm reluctant to cut you off. Are you able to give a very quick version? I know, Sean, you're genius at this. So, well, why don't we try really quickly? Just make your one point, and then we'll pull to a close. Sean.
Okay, I was just waiting for host. Okay, so I was actually writing it into the chat, and you called on me. So I was going to say that Rabbi Barbara had pointed out that Tov appears first about evening and morning, and we know that Lo Tov first appears about solitude. And I keep coming back to something that we haven't talked about yet, which is epistemological humility, which is the knowledge that we may not be right, and the humility to accept that. And so at some level, I think that that is the only like that moment of finding right and wrong comes in the capacity for moral reasoning that can only exist if we aren't alone, because there's somebody challenging us, and that we have that constant awareness that we actually might be wrong.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. Tony and Judith, I'm going to give you a chance to do a very brief word. Tony?
Yeah, quickly. Yeah, it was going back to something that Isra said about the constancy of the Torah, and and you were talking about it, Rabbi Brous, that as our awareness grows, I just lost my train. Our moral choices, our moral choices grow in the same way. Like in the past summer during the BLM protests, we had to ask deeper, more probing questions about, right and wrong, justice. So so the Torah, like the Constitution, is meant to evolve, and as is our awareness, as we become more enlightened and move to more godlike persona, we ask harder, more difficult questions. That was going on this summer. Do we defund the police? Just more difficult moral questions come up. That was sort of the thumbnail.
Thank you, Tony. I mean, I'll just say, and then Rabbi Kasher, turn it to you to close, but it is impossible for me to understand God not wanting us to seek out knowledge and to work to acquire discernment between what's right and wrong. And so I understand that biases my read of this. What I read is a God that's hungry to be in real relationship with human beings who have cultivated a moral sensibility in which we can act both from love of God, but also from an awareness that we develop ourselves of what is right and what is wrong. And so I think this is the perfect way to start this conversation, Rabbi Kasher, and I'm grateful to you for bringing it, because so much of this is about our own discernment, about it's very complicated to live in the world right now. It's not easy. And maybe one, if nothing else, maybe one takeaway from this story is there's no easy fruit you can pull from the tree and ingest and have all the answers. It's just not so simple. And so what we have to do together is kind of pull the truth out. And so I'm really looking to this class over the course of these weeks together as an opportunity to like peel away layers or pull the truth out of that, out of the container and try to work on discernment together. Rabbi Kasher, do you want to close?
Beautiful. I mean, first of all, I just want to say that one of the things that that you did, Rabbi Brous, that was so valuable for me is to suggest that we couldn't start with Sinai. We couldn't start with the covenant. These stories are there for a reason, because the Torah, humanity, God needs to like work out some of these basic questions before we ever get to standing before a covenant and saying, yeah, I'm willing to commit to a just social order. First, you have to think about some of these basic questions. So that's very revelatory for me. The other thing that, and maybe just close with this, is I want to just pick up on a phrase that Tony just used, which is that as we develop, we've been talking all night about this development. And Tony said we become more and more like God in that development. I think we've done good work in thinking about like these questions of what it means to know what good and evil is or might be. But we still, I think, have this question hanging over this conversation of why it is that God is so resistant to that. So we'll keep asking that question. But I just want to give one last sort of expression of that resistance, which is that God gets upset that they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then God says, and let me just put it on screen for you here. God says, now that the person has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, what if he should stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever? Right? So that's a very strange, like I said, there's more to think about there. Like, why is God so freaked out? But even in the phrasing, you hear some of what Tony was just saying, which is that whatever else the knowledge of good and evil is, it is something that makes us more godlike. It is something that enhances that image of God within us. So it is messy and it is complicated, and it does take a lifetime of struggling and learning. And then, as Sean said, we're never even sure if we have the answers. But being in this process of seeking this knowledge is a process of cultivating our own divine spark of the divinity within us. So I hope that will be true also for this class, for this journey that we're taking together, that we clarify these things for ourselves, really give substance to the work that we do in this community, but also as we do so, that we become more manifested in the divinity that lives within us all. So thanks everybody for this first conversation. I look forward to hearing Rabbi Brous lead us next time, and look forward to having you all back. We'll see you next week.
Thanks everyone.